I never planned on spending that afternoon rummaging through the attic of my grandfather's old house. The place always felt heavy, like the walls themselves carried secrets too heavy to breathe out. But after his passing, the responsibility fell to me to sort, to clear, to uncover whatever remnants of his life lingered in the dust. I climbed the creaking stairs with a mixture of reluctance and curiosity, the wooden steps groaning beneath my weight, each echo a reminder of time slipping away. The attic air was thick with the smell of old wood, mothballs, and something faintly metallic, like rust or forgotten blood. As I sifted through boxes of faded photographs and brittle papers, my fingers brushed against an envelope, oddly out of place in its pristine condition. It was yellowed with age, sealed tightly, and simply addressed to me. To that moment, holding that letter, was when everything started to shift. The room around me felt colder suddenly, though the late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the dusty window panes. I hesitated, sensing that opening this envelope might unravel a tapestry woven with pain and silence. There was something about the way it lay beneath a loose floorboard, as if someone had hidden it deliberately, knowing it might never be found. My heartbeat picked up. The creak of a distant floorboard sounded like a warning in the silence. I could almost hear whispers brushing past me, memories clawing to be heard. Slowly, I peeled the fragile seal and unfolded the paper inside. The ink had faded into a pale sepia, the handwriting uneven, as if penned by someone struggling against fear or despair. The words inside promised answers but also threatened to dredge up shadows best left buried. And in that moment, the attic ceased to be just an attic. It became a threshold into a world I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. Even now, I remember the scent of that paper, dry, musty, with a trace of something sharp and bitter like iron. My hands trembled as I read the first lines, each word pulling me deeper into a story that would haunt every step I took afterward. The attic light dimmed as clouds swallowed the sun, and a chill settled over me, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I folded the letter carefully, knowing that what I held was not just a piece of family history but a key to something far darker. The ordinary afternoon had become a turning point, a crossing from innocence into a labyrinth of long-hidden horrors. And as I climbed down the attic stairs, the weight of that letter pressed against my chest, heavy as the silence that now filled the house. Returning to the Grayson estate felt like stepping into a dream twisted by time and sorrow. The mansion sat perched atop Hollow Hill, its silhouette jagged against a sky bruised with dusk. The air was thick and damp, carrying the sharp scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, heavy with the promise of rain. As I approached, the iron gates groaned open with a reluctant creak, as if the house itself resented my intrusion. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, echoing like a slow drumbeat in the quiet. Shadows clung to every corner of the sprawling grounds, twisted branches reaching like skeletal hands against the fading light. The house seemed alive, not with warmth, but with a cold watchfulness, as if the walls had absorbed the grief and terror of generations past, and were silently waiting to reveal their secrets. The heavy wooden door resisted my push, groaning open to reveal a stale, suffocating air that smelled of dust, old smoke and something else, something faintly sour and unsettling, like forgotten sorrow. The floorboards creaked beneath me as I stepped inside, and the flickering light from my lantern barely pierced the gloom. There was an oppressive quiet, the kind that fills a place when time itself has stopped moving. I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere deep within the house, each drop falling like a small echoing heartbeat. The faded wallpaper peeled in curling strips, revealing bare plaster beneath, and the faint traces of mold and rot. Somewhere, a rat scurried, its claws scratching against the wood, breaking the silence with a sudden, sharp noise. It wasn't just an old abandoned house, it was a tomb of memories, and every breath I took felt like disturbing dust settled long ago. As I moved through the dim hallways, the weight of the house settled deeper on my shoulders, There was a strange stillness that pressed against my skin, like invisible fingers gripping tight. I remembered stories told in hushed tones by the villagers, whispers of the Grayson family's strange habits, their growing isolation, and the shadows that never left the estate. And now, standing inside those walls, I understood. This was a place where silence was enforced by fear, where every corner held the echo of something broken. My skin prickled with unease, but beneath the dread was something darker, a relentless curiosity, a pull I couldn't resist. The house wasn't just waiting for me, it was daring me to uncover the truth buried beneath its cracked facade. And as night settled in, wrapping the world outside in velvet black, I felt the first stirrings of a story that would change everything I thought I knew. The moment I stepped into the Grayson family parlor, the air grew heavier, thick with dust, memory, and something I couldn't quite name. The walls were lined with portraits, each frame a window into a past that felt impossibly distant, yet hauntingly close. The faces stared back at me with unnatural stillness. Mother, father, children, all posed in stiff smiles that never reached their eyes. Their skin was pale, almost waxen, and their gazes seemed empty, like photographs trapped in a moment where life had stopped altogether. I could almost hear the faint tick of a clock somewhere, but it was muted, drowned beneath the silence that swallowed the room whole. There was a scent here too, a mixture of aged wood, fading perfume, and something metallic, like old blood barely concealed beneath layers of varnish. As I moved slowly along the walls, the portraits felt less like images, and more like sentinels, silently guarding secrets I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The heavier the silence grew, the more my skin prickled with the sense that the family's history wasn't just recorded in these frames, but embedded deep into the very fabric of the house. I noticed subtle details. The youngest daughter's eyes darkened as if scratched out with deliberate cruelty, a small boy's hand unnaturally clenched into a fist. It was as if the family had been frozen not by time, but by something far more sinister, something that wanted to hold them captive forever. My breath caught in my throat when a distant creak echoed from upstairs, a reminder that the house was alive with unseen movements, whispering stories behind closed doors. In that room, surrounded by the frozen faces of the Grayson family, I felt the weight of their unspoken suffering press in like a physical force. The house wasn't just a relic, it was a mausoleum of memories steeped in pain and silence. I realized then that my journey wouldn't be just about uncovering facts, it would be about peeling back layers of trauma carefully hidden for decades. The portraits didn't just reflect who the Graysons had been, they were warnings etched in paint, glimpses of a nightmare no history book dared to record. As I turned away from the cold faces and stepped toward the shadowed hallway, a sudden draft brushed past me, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a plea that seemed to float on the stale air, urging me deeper into the house's dark heart. The study felt like stepping into the mind of the Grayson patriarch, dark, cluttered, and suffocating. The heavy oak desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with scattered papers yellowed by time, ink bottles cracked and dried, and a few rusted keys that looked like relics from another century. The scent of aged leather and dust hung thick in the air, mingling with a faint, sour tang that made my stomach tighten. Light from a grimy window fell in uneven patches, casting long shadows across the room. As I ran my fingers over the desk's worn wood, the silence was broken only by the creak of the old ceiling fan swaying slowly, like a pendulum counting down secrets waiting to be uncovered. Something about the desk drew me in, an instinctive pull, like a whispered invitation. My hands searched for anything unusual, fingers tracing the edges and seams until I discovered a narrow gap beneath the main drawer. It yielded to gentle pressure, revealing a hidden compartment barely wide enough for a hand. Inside I found a small bundle of journals tied with faded twine, and beneath them, a stack of crude sketches, disturbing images of shadowy figures and ritualistic symbols that twisted and writhed across the paper. The drawings were raw and desperate, as if made by someone trying to make sense of horrors they couldn't escape. Flipping through the journals, the words inside trembled with fear and obsession, revealing a mind unraveling in the grip of something far darker than ordinary despair. As I sat back, clutching the journals in my hands, the room seemed to close in around me. The faint buzz of the fan, the scratch of my fingers on paper, and the soft thud of my heartbeat filled the silence. I realized this was more than a study. It was a vault of forbidden knowledge, a record of a man descending into madness. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating, as if the house was warning me to stop. But the stories in those pages demanded to be heard, and I knew I was already too deep to turn back. The weight of the patriarch's twisted secrets settled on my chest, pressing me down as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen and lean closer, watching, waiting. The hidden drawer wasn't just a secret. It was the first glimpse into the darkness that had consumed the Grayson family from within. The village nurse's house sat at the edge of the town, a weathered cottage wrapped in creeping ivy and shadowed by gnarled oaks. When I arrived, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fading wildflowers, and the soft clatter of rain began to tap against the window panes. Inside, the nurse, an old woman with skin like crumpled parchment and eyes sharp despite the years, welcomed me with a silence that spoke louder than words. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, the aroma of bitter herbs filling the cramped kitchen. Something in the way she avoided my gaze made the air between us tense, heavy with unspoken memories. It was clear she carried the weight of the Grayson family's dark past, a burden no one else dared to mention. As the rain softened outside, she began to speak in low, halting whispers, fragments of a story buried deep beneath the surface of polite conversation. She spoke of the children, pale, quiet, and withdrawn, who lived under the strict control of the Grayson parents. Her voice faltered as she recalled nights when the house fell deathly silent, broken only by muffled cries that no one was meant to hear. There was fear in her eyes as she described the strange rules imposed on the family, rules that seemed to cage more than just bodies. She hinted at rituals and punishments whispered about in the village, but never openly acknowledged, a darkness that festered behind the grand estate's walls. Listening to her, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. These were no ordinary tales of cruelty, but whispers of something deeply sinister. When her voice finally faltered into silence, the room seemed to shrink around me. The nurse's gaze lingered on mine, heavy with warning and sorrow. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the chill it left behind settled deep in my bones. I realized then that her story was a fragile thread, connecting the present to a past, so dark it had nearly been erased. Her whispers were not just recollections, they were pleas to remember, to acknowledge horrors that the town preferred to bury. As I left her cottage, stepping back into the misty afternoon, I felt the shadows of the Grayson family stretching further than I'd imagined, their secrets woven tightly into the very fabric of the place, waiting for someone to uncover them. The basement door stood at the end of a narrow hallway, half hidden behind a threadbare curtain stained with time. Its heavy oak surface was scarred and swollen from years of neglect, the iron handle cold and rough beneath my fingers. The air around it felt thicker, colder, almost like a wall pressing in. I remember how the hairs on the back of my neck rose as I stood before it, an invisible barrier between the familiar world upstairs and the shadowed unknown below. The faint sound of dripping water echoed faintly from beyond, each drop a slow, hollow echo that seemed to pulse with the beating of my heart. I hesitated, the silence stretching, thick with unspoken dread, as if the house itself was warning me to turn away. With a slow breath, I gripped the handle and forced the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, like a low moan from the house's depths. The air that escaped was icy and stale, carrying the scent of damp stone, mold and something fouler, a sickly sweetness that clawed at my throat. My flashlight cut a narrow beam into the darkness, revealing steep stone steps, slick with moisture, leading down into a cavernous blackness that swallowed the light whole. The cold wrapped around me instantly, seeping through my clothes and settling in my bones like an ancient frost. As I descended, each footstep echoed off the walls, amplifying the oppressive silence that clung to every surface. It felt as though I was crossing a threshold into a place where time had stopped, where the darkest family secrets had been buried. Halfway down, my light caught something glinting on the wall, rusted iron hooks and chains, stained with dark, crusted residue. The sight twisted my stomach into knots, as a wave of revulsion and fear washed over me. I could almost hear faint whispers, distant sobs, or maybe just the echoes of my imagination, but the feeling was undeniable. This basement was more than just storage, it was a prison. The walls seemed to close in tighter. As I reached the cold, damp floor, the air thick with sorrow and suffering trapped long ago, I wanted to look away, to run back up the stairs to the safety of daylight, but something rooted me in place, a need to understand, to face the shadows the Grayson family had tried so desperately to hide. And so I took another step deeper into the darkness, knowing that there was no turning back. The basement's darkness seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight whole, but as I swept it across the walls, the faint outlines of chains came into view, heavy iron links hanging from rusted hooks embedded deep in the cold stone. Their surfaces were pitted and stained, coated in a crust that looked like old blood and years of neglect. The smell hit me then, a sickening mix of damp earth, decay, and something coppery that settled thick in my throat. I swallowed hard, the metallic tang filling my mouth as my heart pounded louder in the crushing silence. The chain swayed faintly, moved by a draft that whispered down from the cracks above, or maybe by memories that refused to rest. As I moved closer, I saw scratch marks on the floor beneath the chains, long deep gouges carved into the stone, as if by desperate hands clawing for freedom. My skin crawled, the oppressive cold seeped through my jacket, chilling me to the bone, and every breath I took felt like inhaling sorrow itself. I imagined the terrified faces of children, the soft sobs muffled by the thick walls, the silent prayers swallowed by the darkness. It was impossible to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the very air was heavy with the weight of trapped souls. I ran my fingers over the rough metal, feeling the cold bite into my skin, and a shiver ran down my spine as I pulled back, overwhelmed by the darkness pressing in. Turning away from the chains, I shone my light around the room, now aware of the silence as a presence rather than absence. No footsteps echoed, no voices called out, yet I felt watched by something unseen and endless. The basement held its breath, refusing to let go of the horrors buried within it. I knew then that these chains were more than metal. They were the physical evidence of a nightmare that no history would tell. The basement was a tomb of suffering, and as I climbed back toward the stairs, the echo of those chains dragging in the dark stayed with me, a haunting rhythm that followed every step I took. At the end of a narrow hallway on the ground floor, I found the nursery, a small room frozen in time, suffocated by neglect and shadow. The door hung crooked on its hinges, peeling paint flaking onto the floor, like brittle memories. Inside the air was stale and heavy, smelling of damp wood, faded fabric, and something faintly sickly sweet, like decayed flowers. Dust motes floated sluggishly in the pale gray light filtering through grime-coated windows, settling on broken toys scattered across the floor, a cracked porcelain doll missing an eye, a wooden rocking horse worn smooth by years of absence. The silence was absolute, but for the creaking of the house, as if the room itself mourned what had been lost. I hesitated, the weight of the room pressing against my chest, a quiet grief pulsing in the shadows. As I stepped further inside, my fingers brushed against a small tarnished locket, lying half-buried beneath a tattered blanket. Its metal was cold and rough, engraved with delicate initials that had long faded. Picking it up, the locket's sharp chill bit into my palm, anchoring me in the moment. The room seemed to hold its breath as memories crept in, soft lullabies silenced too soon, tiny hands reaching out in vain, the echo of childish laughter swallowed by darkness. I imagined the nursery filled with light once, the air warm with hope and innocence. But here, that hope had rotted away, replaced by shadows that clung to the walls and whispered of forgotten promises and broken dreams. The locket felt like a ghost's tether, a tangible remnant of lives lost and love twisted by fear. I lowered the locket carefully back to the floor, my heart heavy with a sorrow I couldn't name. The nursery wasn't just a room. It was a shrine to absence, a hollow echo of what the Grayson children never had. Turns. As I turned toward the door, the faint sound of a child's laugh, a soft, distant giggle, seemed to flutter just beyond hearing, like a cruel trick of the mind. I froze, breath catching in my throat, but the room remained still, save for the dust swirling in a shaft of weak sunlight. That fragile moment lingered long after I left, a whisper of innocence lost to darkness, a reminder that some wounds refuse to heal, no matter how deeply they are buried. Among the scattered papers and hidden drawers of the house, I found a small, worn, leather-bound journal, its edges frayed and pages yellowed with age. The cover bore no title, but inside were pages filled with tight, hurried handwriting. Elizabeth Graysons. Holding the journal felt like touching a fragile lifeline, a voice trapped in time trying desperately to be heard. The ink was smudged in places, as though tears or sweat had blurred the words. Opening it, I was immediately pulled into her world, a place of growing fear and isolation, where the walls closed in tighter with each passing day, and hope flickered like a dying candle. Her entries began with simple observations, the sound of the wind rattling the shutters, the way sunlight failed to reach the basement window, the distant cries muffled by thick walls. But soon her words grew darker, filled with anxiety and dread. She wrote of the family's strange controlling rules, how the children were kept silent, their movements watched, their voices stifled. Elizabeth's handwriting trembled as she described the nights when the house fell into unnatural silence, and the fear that gripped her heart like cold iron. Her words carried the weight of a child, forced to witness horrors no one else dared to acknowledge, shadows creeping in the corners, whispered voices calling her name, and the feeling that escape was a distant dream slipping further away. Reading her journal, I felt a profound sadness settle over me, a connection to a girl who had been trapped behind these walls, her pain hidden beneath layers of silence. Elizabeth's writing was a desperate plea, to remember, to understand, to break the cycle of darkness. The more I read, the more I realized this journal wasn't just a record of events, it was a testament to the resilience of a spirit caught in the grip of terror. Closing the book, I sat back, the room around me seeming to pulse with the echoes of her voice. For the first time, the faces in those family portraits felt less like frozen statues, and more like lost souls, reaching out through the decades, begging not to be forgotten. The village was small, a place where everyone knew each other's names and their business, but when the Grayson children began to vanish, the usual chatter turned to uneasy silence. I visited the local inn, where an old man sat by the hearth, his eyes clouded with memories better left alone. He spoke slowly, his voice a low rasp, telling me how one by one the children simply stopped appearing. There were no frantic searches, no desperate pleas, just a gradual fading from the village's daily life. The air outside was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and wood smoke, but the warmth of the hearth couldn't thaw the chill that settled deep in his words. It was as if the town had chosen to look away, a silent agreement to bury the disappearances beneath layers of denial. Walking the paths the children once roamed, I felt the emptiness like a physical ache. The fields lay quiet, the grass growing wild and tangled where play once echoed. The faint rustling of leaves stirred memories in my mind, the laughter that no longer came, the footsteps that stopped abruptly. An oppressive stillness hung over the landscape, broken only by the occasional caw of a lone crow, its sharp cry cutting through the thick silence. I imagined the faces of those children, small hands reaching out, eyes wide with confusion and fear, and it was impossible not to feel the weight of their absence pressing down on the earth itself. The village's collective silence felt like a wound, raw and festering, hidden beneath polite smiles and hushed conversations. Later, as dusk settled and shadows lengthened, I stood at the edge of the town cemetery. The ground was uneven here, some graves fresh, others worn and forgotten. The air was damp and cold, the scent of earth and decaying leaves mixing with something darker, regret perhaps or guilt. No stone bore the names of the missing children, their resting places lost to time and shame. I ran my fingers over a weathered tombstone, the rough surface biting into my skin, and felt the sorrow seep into my bones. The disappearances weren't just lost lives, they were erased stories swallowed whole by silence and fear. And standing there beneath a sky heavy with stars, I knew that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, refused to stay hidden forever. The Grayson family portrait hung in the main hallway, a grand, imposing canvas that seemed to command the entire house. I approached it cautiously, feeling the weight of generations staring back at me. The painting captured the family in formal poses, stiff smiles, elegant clothes frozen in time. But as I studied the faces, something felt profoundly wrong. The eyes especially, some were scratched out with deliberate violence, jagged lines slashing across the canvas like wounds. Others seemed to shift in the flickering candlelight, shadows gathering unnaturally beneath them. It was as if the painter had tried to hide something beneath layers of oil and color, a silent message encoded in brushstrokes and chipped varnish. Leaning closer, I noticed subtle distortions, the mother's hand twisted in an unnatural claw, the youngest child's smile too wide, too forced. A chilling realization settled over me. This was no ordinary family portrait. It was a visual record of pain and secrets, a testament to fractured souls trapped behind the veneer of respectability. The thick smell of turpentine and aged paint filled the air, mixing with the musty scent of the house, and I felt a sudden cold draft brush past me, as if the very spirits in the painting were exhaling. My skin prickled, and for a moment I could have sworn one of the children's eyes flickered with life, pleading silently to be understood. Stepping back, I let my fingers trail along the frame, rough and chipped with age. The portrait wasn't just a decoration, it was a warning, a puzzle that begged to be solved. Its distortions mirrored the fractured history of the Grayson family, a history stained with cruelty and silence. As the candle flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall, I felt the room grow colder, the house itself whispering its darkest truths. That portrait was more than paint and canvas. It was the first real glimpse into the horror beneath the surface, and I knew then that peeling back those layers would reveal far more than I could imagine. I found myself drawn to the family cemetery, under a heavy cloak of night, the kind where the darkness feels thick enough to swallow whole. The path to the graveyard was barely visible, shrouded in fog that curled like cold fingers around the gnarled trees lining the way. Each step on the soft earth muffled beneath my boots, the damp scent of moss and decayed leaves mingling with the distant sharp tang of wet stone. The silence was so complete it pressed against my eardrums, broken only by the occasional snap of a brittle branch and the distant howl of a lone wolf. As I pushed open the wrought iron gate, its rusty hinges groaned like a warning, the sound swallowed instantly by the night. Inside, the grave markers stood like pale sentinels beneath the moon's cold glow, some tall and ornate, others low and crumbling into the earth. The ground was uneven, patches of fresh soil telling stories no headstone dared reveal. I traced my fingers over a particularly weathered tombstone, the cold stone rough beneath my skin, its inscription eroded almost beyond recognition. The cemetery felt alive with memories, silent voices carried by the wind, whispers of grief and loss tangled in the rustling leaves. A chill settled deep in my bones, as I noticed a cluster of small unmarked graves near the far corner. They seemed deliberately hidden, forgotten by time and man alike. The shadows here felt different, heavier, almost watchful. Standing there, surrounded by the sleeping dead, I felt an overwhelming weight settle over me. The air seemed to thicken with sorrow, and the night itself held its breath. It was clear that the graveyard was not just a resting place, but a silent witness to the darkest chapters of the Grayson family story. Some graves bore no names, no dates, just empty spaces carved out by shame and silence. I wondered who was buried there, their stories swallowed by the earth, and as the wind stirred, carrying the scent of damp soil and forgotten tears, I felt the past reach out, pulling me deeper into a history that refused to stay buried. The night had folded around me like a shroud, and I knew I could never look at this place the same way again. It was late afternoon when the stranger appeared in the village square, a tall man cloaked in shadow, despite the fading light. His face was weathered, eyes sharp and dark, carrying the weight of years and secrets he seemed reluctant to share. I first noticed him standing quietly by the well, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the crowd's chatter, as if he carried the invisible burden of knowing more than he should. When he finally approached me, his footsteps were slow but deliberate, the gravel crunching sharply beneath worn boots. The air between us felt charged, thick with unspoken warnings. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough, a whisper laced with urgency. "Some stones are better left unturned," he said, eyes flickering with something fierce, almost desperate. His warning sent a chill straight through me, colder than the autumn wind that swept through the town. I wanted to dismiss him, call him a madman, or a cautious fool, but there was something genuine in his caution that made my skin crawl. He spoke of the Grayson family's past like it was a living thing, a darkness that refused to die, always waiting beneath the surface to consume those who dared pry too deeply. His voice dropped even lower as he told of others who had vanished, swallowed by the shadows after digging too far. The flicker of fear in his eyes was real, raw. I could almost feel the invisible chains of history tightening around me, binding me to a story I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. Before he turned away, the stranger fixed me with a lingering look, equal parts warning and sorrow. The wind picked up then, rattling the leaves, and carrying the sharp scent of burning wood. For a moment, the village seemed to hold its breath, as if the very earth beneath us knew what was coming. And just like that, he vanished into the gathering dusk, leaving me with the echo of his words ringing in my ears. "Some stones are better left unturned." The warning haunted me, twisting in my mind like a dark knot. But by then, I was already too deep, caught in the pull of a past that refused to stay buried, and the stranger's voice became a shadow trailing every step I took. The letter was hidden deep inside a crumbling leather-bound box beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom, an envelope sealed with cracked wax, its paper brittle with age. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, the scent of aged parchment and faint hints of ink lingering in the air. I could almost taste the weight of the words before I even unfolded the fragile sheet. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, as if written by a man fighting his own unraveling sanity. Each sentence etched a slow, unbearable descent into a darkness I had only begun to glimpse. This was no mere family document. It was a confession, raw and horrifying, the patriarch's voice bleeding through time to reveal the twisted beliefs and sins that had poisoned the Grayson bloodline. As I read, the room seemed to grow colder, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe in sympathy with the letter's grim truths. He wrote of sacrifices made in the name of preserving the family legacy, rituals performed in secret chambers beneath the house, and a growing madness that gripped his soul like a vise. The words were heavy with regret and defiance, a desperate attempt to explain horrors that defied reason. I could feel the patriarch's voice trembling with a mixture of pride and horror, confessing acts that tore apart the very fabric of his family, acts he believed were necessary to protect their name from an unseen evil. The air thickened, pressing down on me like a suffocating shroud. When I finally folded the letter back into its envelope, a shiver coursed through me, as though the house itself exhaled a long-held breath. The confession was more than a revelation. It was a key unlocking the darkest chambers of the Grayson curse. I felt the weight of those words settle heavily on my chest, a burden passed down through generations, never spoken but always present. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, filled with the echo of sins long buried, and in that silence, I understood that the story I had uncovered was no longer just history. It was a living nightmare that had clawed its way through time, waiting for someone to bear witness. The library was a cavernous room filled with towering shelves, their spines cracked and faded, the scent of old paper and leather curling thick in the air. But it was an anomaly on the far wall that caught my attention, a faint outline where the wallpaper didn't quite match, a subtle groove beneath a row of books. My fingers traced the edges, and a hidden latch gave way with a reluctant click. The panel swung open slowly, revealing a narrow passage swallowed by darkness. The stale air that escaped was heavier than anything I'd encountered before, thick with the scent of mold dust and something coppery, like old blood. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then swallowed my fear and stepped inside. The room beyond was small and windowless, its stone walls smeared with faded, cryptic markings, twisted symbols painted hastily in dark reds and blacks. The air was cold and suffocating, pressing down like a weight on my chest. There were stains on the floor, dark patches that glistened faintly in the beam of my flashlight, stains that smelled metallic and sharp enough to make bile rise in my throat. The silence here was different. It felt alive, heavy with a restless sorrow. As I scanned the walls, I felt a presence pressing in from all sides, as though unseen eyes watched my every move. My skin prickled, and for the first time, I truly understood the depth of the evil that had been kept hidden within this house's bones. I swallowed hard, and stepped back toward the library, the panel closing behind me with a soft thud that echoed like a closing coffin lid. The taste of iron lingered in my mouth, and the chill in my bones refused to fade. That hidden room was no accident. It was a chamber built to contain unspeakable acts, a shrine to darkness no history book would ever mention. Walking away, I felt the house's secrets wrap tighter around me, pulling me deeper into the Grayson family's nightmare. Every step echoed with the silent screams of those who had suffered here, and I knew the truth was a weight that would follow me long after I left this place behind. The house seemed to hold its breath as midnight approached, a stillness so thick it pressed against my skin like a cold veil. Guided by the faint flicker of candlelight, I found deep within the hidden room. I descended again into the basement where the air was heavy with the scent of damp stone, and something far fouler, a sickly sweetness that clung like a stain. The flickering shadows cast by the candles danced eerily on the walls, revealing glimpses of crude symbols etched into the stone floor, faded but unmistakable. My heartbeat echoed in the silence, each thump a thunderclap in the oppressive darkness. The air tasted sharp and metallic, like iron and desperation, and a faint whisper of chanting seemed to hover just beyond hearing, teasing the edge of my sanity. I moved cautiously, tracing the outlines of the circle marked in dust and dried blood, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold stone. The symbols were unlike anything I'd ever seen, twisted, archaic, dripping with malevolence. The silence was shattered suddenly by the faintest breath, a movement too subtle to be anything but supernatural. The flickering candlelight threw grotesque shadows that seemed to shift and writhe, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. A chill wrapped around me, icy fingers closing in, as if the house itself was alive, guarding its terrible secret. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting for an intruder to falter. As I stood there, overwhelmed by a sense of dread and fascination, I realized that this was more than a ritual. It was a desperate invocation, a summoning born of fear and madness. The patriarch's madness had taken physical form in this chamber, binding the family's fate in a dark covenant. The air grew thicker, the shadows deeper, and the house seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of something ancient and hungry. I wanted to flee, to escape the oppressive darkness, but I was rooted to the spot, trapped by the gravity of the Grayson family's curse. In that suffocating silence, I understood that some horrors are eternal, and the midnight ritual was their unholy echo, forever etched into the bones of Hollow Hill. The last entry in Elizabeth's journal was a sudden, jagged stop, a chilling silence after weeks of frantic writing. I remember sitting alone in the dim glow of the fireplace, the leather-bound journal trembling in my hands as I stared at the empty page that followed her final words. There was a palpable stillness in the room, as if time itself had paused, waiting for a truth too terrible to speak aloud. The faint crackle of the dying fire was the only sound, but it felt deafening against the weight of her disappearance. I could almost feel the ghost of her presence in the cold air, a fragile whisper caught between hope and despair, slipping quietly into the shadows. The village was tight-lipped when I asked about Elizabeth's fate. Some avoided my questions, others offered only vague glances, their eyes dark pools of unspoken fear. One old woman, her voice barely a whisper, told me that Elizabeth had vanished without a trace one night, swallowed by the same darkness that haunted the family. The chill in her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself retracing Elizabeth's last known steps through the winding, fog-laden streets. The damp earth seemed to cling to my boots, the smell of wet stone and rotting leaves thick in the cold air. Every shadow I passed felt like a reminder of her absence, a void left behind that echoed louder than any scream. In the silence that followed, I realized Elizabeth's disappearance was more than just a missing person story. It was a symbol of everything twisted and broken within the Grayson family. The house, the chains, the rituals, all led to this final cruel erasure. Standing at the edge of Hollow Hill, the wind tugged at my coat and whispered through the trees, carrying a sorrow that felt as old as the earth itself. Elizabeth was gone, but her story lingered, a haunting thread woven through the dark fabric of the past. And as I closed the journal, the silence that filled the room felt less like an ending, and more like a warning. Some shadows never fade, they only wait for the next soul to wander too close. The village that surrounded the Grayson estate seemed to carry its own heavy secret, a quietness that wasn't just the absence of noise but a presence in itself. As I wandered through its narrow, uneven streets, the air felt thick with a tension that pulled at the edges of my skin, making each breath feel deliberate, cautious. The faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth mingled with an undercurrent of something sour, a subtle decay that clung to the corners of the village like a stubborn stain. Shops stood shuttered early, and windows were drawn tight, reflecting empty gazes rather than life. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was brittle and watchful, as if the villagers themselves held their breath, afraid to disturb the fragile balance they'd created. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of the villagers, quick furtive movements behind curtains, shadowed figures huddled in doorways, eyes darting away the moment they noticed me. Their faces were drawn and pale, etched with lines of fear and resignation. When I tried to speak, voices faltered or hushed quickly, leaving me with half answers and a thickening sense of isolation. The village wasn't just avoiding the Grayson family's history, it was burying it beneath layers of silence and shame, a collective amnesia born of fear. Each step through the streets felt heavier, as if the ground itself remembered every whispered secret and unspoken horror, refusing to let the past go. By the time night fell, the village had retreated entirely behind locked doors and drawn curtains, leaving the streets empty and dark, except for the flicker of a lone lantern far down a side alley. The silence deepened, pressing in like a living thing, cold and unyielding. Standing there, I understood that this silence was both protection and punishment, an unspoken agreement to forget, to pretend the Grayson horrors never happened. But beneath that fragile quiet lay a restless sorrow, a wound that pulsed beneath the surface, threatening to break open at any moment. And as the wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying the faint scent of rain and forgotten tears. I knew the village's silence was not peace, it was a shadow, as haunting as the Grayson legacy itself. The air inside the old Grayson mansion was thick, as though every breath drew in centuries of buried pain and secrets. I stood alone in what once must have been the grand dining hall, now dim and heavy with dust. The faint smell of stale smoke and mildew hung in the air, mixing with the faint metallic scent that seemed to permeate every corner. My flashlight's beam trembled as I moved slowly across the floorboards, each creak echoing like a whisper from the past. The silence felt alive, charged, waiting, as if the house itself was holding its breath, ready to reveal its darkest truth. I felt the weight of the entire family's history pressing in, a suffocating presence that made my skin crawl. In the center of the room, half buried beneath broken floorboards and a torn rug, I found an old, dust-covered chest. Its wood was cracked and swollen with age, the rusty hinges groaning when I pried it open. Inside were letters, photographs, and a final journal, a record that pulled back the last veil, exposing the horrifying core of the Grayson nightmare. The pages detailed a pact made by the family patriarch, a desperate bargain with a shadowy force to preserve their bloodline at any cost. It spoke of sacrifices and betrayals, madness and despair, the true source of the family's torment. As I read, the room seemed to close in tighter, shadows stretching longer, as if the house itself recoiled from the revelation. Closing the journal, I shivered as a cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it the faintest echoes of whispered voices, regrets, pleas, warnings. The final revelation was more than history. It was a curse etched into the very walls of the mansion. I realized that the Grayson family's story was not just one of horror, but a tragic cycle destined to repeat, unless the past was confronted. As I stepped back, the house groaned softly, and I knew that some secrets refused to stay hidden, their shadows lingering, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The morning I left Hollow Hill, a thick fog curled around the village like a shroud, softening the edges of the twisted trees and worn cobblestones. The damp air clung to my skin, carrying the scent of wet earth and faint traces of smoke from distant chimneys. As I gathered my things, the weight of the Grayson family's story settled heavily on my shoulders, an invisible burden that no sunlight could chase away. The house, the chains, the secrets, they all lingered in my mind like shadows refusing to fade, whispering in the silence long after I closed the door behind me. Walking away from the mansion for the last time, I felt the oppressive stillness of Hollow Hill pressing in from every side. The village seemed asleep, its silence deeper than ever, as if holding its breath to protect itself from the past. I caught one last glimpse of the Grayson estate, through the mist, its dark silhouette standing like a sentinel against the pale sky. The sorrow and fear woven into its walls felt alive, a living entity that would endure far beyond my visit. As my footsteps faded into the distance, the chill in the air reminded me that some stories never truly end. They linger etched into the very soil, waiting to be remembered or forgotten. Behind me, Hollow Hill remained silent, but I knew that beneath its quiet surface, the echoes of the Grayson family's nightmare would continue to haunt the village and anyone who dared to listen. I carried their story with me, a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most respectable facades. As the fog swallowed the path ahead, I understood that some shadows are permanent, and some histories are too disturbing to ever be fully laid to rest.